and said it from the very start. There was no subtlety, no need to read between the lines, no need to resort to tinfoil hat conspiracy theories. They said what they were going to do, and they did it. They said, we will eliminate everything, and that they had released all the restraints on the Israeli army. These are both quotes from the Israeli defense minister, and they made clear over and over again that they held the entire population of Gaza to be collectively guilty. That's what the Israeli president, for example, said. As well as, you wanted hell, you will get hell, as the Israeli army coordinator of the occupied territory said. Or, for example, invoking the biblical story of Amalek, which calls for the killing of all men, women, children and livestock, as Benjamin Netanyahu referred to. Now, we also know that the government is jam-packed full of people who want to ethnically cleanse Gaza because they keep saying so. And indeed, 11 Israeli cabinet ministers attended a conference at the end of January committed to the Israeli resettlement of Gaza and the so-called voluntary migration of the Palestinian population. Not subtle. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself back in December was, according to the Israeli newspaper Hayom, pushing for the so-called voluntary migration of Gaza's population, adding, our problem is the countries that are willing to absorb them, and we are working on it. Now, you might wonder why this was not more widely reported on, and why the Western media has failed over and over and over again to report the stated intentions of Israeli leaders. And your questions there have pretty solid foundations. So we're just clear. So we're clear about the depraved lie that is so-called voluntary migration. I know people are aware, probably, I hope, of how war criminals throughout history use euphemisms like re-education camp or enhanced interrogation technique. That means torture, by the way. What voluntary migration really means is making Gaza completely inhospitable, like 70% of Gaza's homes being severely damaged or destroyed. That is as is, with more damage to inevitably come, or destroying the healthcare system, or access to food, or fresh water. We could go on. And then saying, well, look, they can't survive there anymore, can they? So as a humanitarian gesture, I guess they'll all have to leave. Now, there is the obvious precedent, of course, of Palestinians being forced to leave their homes and never being allowed to return, like the Nakba, the so-called catastrophe in 1948. That's when Israel was founded, when 750,000 Palestinians or so were driven from their homes. That was accompanied with 15,000 or so violent deaths. Or the perhaps 300,000 more driven from their homes in 1967, and so on. Now, Gaza's own population are painfully aware of all this. It is their reality. The vast majority of Gaza's population are the families of those driven from their homes in the Nakba. Now, in all of these occasions, the Palestinians driven from their homes were never allowed back, something, of course, they are all too painfully aware of. So when Avi Dichter, an Israeli minister who belongs to Netanyahu's Likud party, says, we're rolling out Nakba 2023, well, again, quite literally, we only have to listen to what they're saying. Now, Egypt's regime, it's an unpleasant regime, by the way, another unpleasant Western-backed regime, but that's for another time. Its dictator El-Sisi has repeatedly warned about the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Back in October, he said, we reject the displacement of Palestinians from their land, and liquidating the Palestinian cause is extremely dangerous. What is happening now in Gaza is an attempt to push citizens to seek refuge and migrate to Egypt. He also made an important point, that if the Israeli onslaught was not an act against Hamas, but rather to push the population to leave, if the Palestinians should be displaced, why not transfer them to the Negev until the end of the war? The Negev desert, to be clear, is in Israel itself. So if Palestinians were temporarily housed there, they would clearly be far more likely to return home, because clearly Israel's got no intention of keeping them within its official borders. Now, Egypt has itself threatened to withdraw from the 1978 peace treaty with Israel, on which regional geopolitics depends, if a ground invasion against Rafah, where, of course, much of the Gaza population now is, if that takes place. Now, all of this context is important when discussing some new disturbing developments. The Sinai Foundation for Human Rights Group is a monitoring group. The Sinai Desert, for those who don't know, is in Egypt. It's right next to Gaza, over the Rafah crossing. Indeed, Rafah, as a city, historically straddles the border between Gaza and Sinai. But that got separated when Israel was forced to withdraw from the Sinai Desert previously, which it had occupied in 1967, along with Gaza and the West Bank. Now, the Sinai Foundation has found workers using heavy machinery, erecting concrete barriers and security towers around a strip of land on the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing, which you'll have heard of. That's, of course, the crucial entry point for humanitarian aid and so on into Gaza. Now, their own view is that this is an effort to establish an isolated area surrounded by walls on the border with the Gaza Strip, with the aim of receiving refugees in the event of a mass exodus.
Being whipped up across the EU, we argued for de-escalation. I've told a story before about a Security and Defence Committee when a big Polish fella turned on me and said I'd some neck arguing for peace against Russia when Russia never invaded us and when we were very lucky on the other side of Europe. And I answered him by saying, yeah, you're absolutely right. But you know what? We too were invaded by somebody just as bad. And they stayed a lot longer. But I don't hear any of ye in here arguing to arm the IRA in case they come back. No, you didn't. You argued for peace. You said we had to live with our neighbours, and that's what ye have to do as well. And when Putin gave them everything they wanted, responded to the provocation and invaded Ukraine, we called for peace and a negotiated settlement. Oh my God, how could we? Why would we do such a thing? Could it be that we were anti-war activists? We'd broken into Shannon after all to search US military planes. I called Barack Obama a war criminal and a hypocrite of the century when he was here before. Could that be the reason? Could it be that we looked at every war in history and found out that wars are not sorted and stopped by more war, but by peace? For God's sake, it couldn't be that. Sure, the only reason it had to be is that we absolutely love Putin. And at best, we were doing it because we're useless idiots, or useful idiots, maybe useless as well, but at worst because we're in the pay of the Kremlin. And we have had serious journalists.
Not surprisingly, there undoubtedly are some Hamas people there too. And so Netanyahu is saying, we want to invade Rafah. Now, there's this problem. There would be massive bloodshed if that happened. So even the Biden administration is saying, don't do it until you evacuate the civilian population. Now, Netanyahu has said, yes, I'll evacuate, but there have been no plans whatsoever. And indeed, if you listen to the far-right ministers in his cabinet, people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, people whose votes Netanyahu depends on to stay in power and to stay out of prison on corruption charges, they're saying the only evacuation that they want is into Egypt, out of Gaza, a forced deportation, probably another Nakba with little prospect that anybody who leaves Gaza would get to come back. And so that's the stake. Everybody's telling Netanyahu, move people someplace else within Gaza, but there's no place else that's safe. Netanyahu's determined to move forward because he needs to keep this war going. Once the war ends, his political reckoning for the intelligence failure of October 7th starts, and he's likely to be out of a job. And we're sort of in this dilemma. Now, the International Court of Justice could intervene. The order that it issued last month had basically three elements to it. One was, take far greater care not to kill civilians. Two was to allow in humanitarian aid. And three was for Israeli government officials to stop their incitement of genocide. And as far as we can tell, it was only the statements that have stopped. The aid has not come in any greater amount. The killing doesn't seem to have stopped. And so, in any event, Israel has to report back to the International Court of Justice on February 23rd. I have no idea what they're going to say because they basically have just ignored the order. But now there is a possibility that even before the 23rd, the court will hear this emergency application from South Africa. And I think it's worth noting that in the original case, South Africa, sought a ceasefire. But I never thought that was in the cards because only the Israeli government, only states, frankly, are before the International Court of Justice. Hamas wasn't there, so the court wasn't going to order a ceasefire of just one side. But Rafah is different because there's not a lot of fighting by Hamas from Rafah, but rather this is just a proposed invasion by Israeli forces. And it is conceivable that the International Court of Justice would order a halt to that. That, of course, begs the question, who enforces that? The UN Security Council has that power, but that requires contending with the US veto, contending with Biden. The person who, frankly, does have the most power to stop all of this bloodshed is Joe Biden. But so far, while he's been outspoken, he's not been willing to put any teeth in his words Most significantly, he's not been willing to stop or even to condition the $3.8 billion in annual U.S. military aid or the massive arms sales to Israel. Those are the kinds of steps that, if taken, Netanyahu would be forced to listen to. But so far, Biden's words are just empty, and Netanyahu ignores them.